one gets interesting, partly because you never know how quick Power Apps, Power Platform is going to work. I have a start of this built out. So we'll go in, start adding some more functionality, playing around with it a little bit. So a little bit about me. I do own my own company, Intelligink, where cloud consulting, Azure, Microsoft 365. I actually got my start doing SharePoint consulting all the way back with SharePoint 2003. So me and SharePoint have a long history together, and as things have moved to the cloud, I've kind of expanded out into Microsoft 365 as a whole, even doing some Azure stuff. I also co-host the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast along with Scott Hogue. Um, Any of you are familiar with him? We've been doing that for almost 5 years now. I think episode 308, 309 came out the other day. Uh, Talk all about, again, Microsoft 365, Azure from the IT side of things. So if you're not tired of me after today, feel free to go check that out. Microsoft certified trainer, certified in Microsoft 365, Azure, security, um, all those fun things. Twitter, LinkedIn. Truth be told, if you want to go hunt me down, connect with me anywhere, just go search for Ben Stegink. I am the only Ben Stegink out there as far as I've been able to tell. So if you go search for me, I own like the entire whole first page of Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, any of those. Just because I don't have to compete. I have a friend named Brian Smith. He has the exact opposite problem as I do when people try to find him. So that is a great way to find me. Just go search for my name out there. So diving into Power Platform and Azure AD, one of the questions you may ask is, well, why would I even want to do this? I can go into Azure AD, I can go update things in Azure AD, I can go change passwords, update user properties. Maybe I'm syncing it from on-premises Active Directory. Uh, I've actually done this more and more for clients. The last year or two, this has actually come up a bunch of times, and I've done this several different times now, different capacities, different functionality. One of them is enforcing conventions. Azure AD, when you're going and filling out something like uh, job titles, and this ties into even consistency for property values, filling out job titles or office locations. Um, Maybe you're even going in and filling out the username, the UPN, email addresses, all that type of stuff. When it comes to Azure AD, that is all just plain text fields. I go into several organizations and you go start looking at email addresses, and one of them is ben@intelligink.com. The next user is bsmith@intelligink.com. Then you go to the next person and it's Jane Doe or Jane.doe@intelligink.com. And based on who entered it in, maybe they weren't aware of conventions, maybe they didn't know what it is, maybe there's even multiple domains with a company, and different users get a different domain with their username. Uh, by forcing a user to go through something like Power Apps, you can go in and set certain rules and automatically create some of those for people, or leveraging PowerShell or Power Automate as you create some of that. I mentioned already consistency. You want consistent titles. You don't want abbreviations in titles. Maybe you have certain offices. You don't want abbreviations in city names or misspellings in city names. Use a dropdown, and I'll show you how we use some of this. Autofill certain properties. Maybe you do want to fill out the employee ID or the address based on a selected office versus always having to remember what an office address is. Go in and auto propagate some of those properties based on selections that you make when you go out and create new users. Another one, and this is one that comes up actually a fair amount, is limiting the access to these Azure AD properties or to Azure AD as a whole. Maybe it's HR that is actually creating new users. You want to pass that off from IT when HR goes through all the paperwork. They go out, fill out all the information in something like Power Apps, hit submit, and it automatically goes out and creates that new user for it. It takes it out of the hands of IT. Or as people get promotions, change roles, move to different offices, whatever it may be, being in IT, I've seen it. Sometimes we're the last people to know about those changes. It tends to go through somebody else, a manager approving it, HR, maybe even sometimes it's the help desk. And you don't necessarily want your help desk to have that full admin access to different aspects of Azure AD. You can go in and limit what they're able to do or give them tools to go in and automate that process of offboarding users or deprovisioning users, or again, updating certain properties. So those are just some of the reasons I've seen where people have started using different components of the Power Platform to start managing those users, those user properties, those user settings within Azure Active Directory. So as we go through this today, some of the components that we'll use, Power Apps is great for building out a UI front end, for adding new users to Azure Active Directory, editing existing users. Maybe you're going in and changing their account status. You want to deprovision a user. You want to set them on leave of absence. Uh, Different things like that. Give your users a nice user interface to go in and do some of that. Power Automate, and I put logic apps under here. As we go through, I'll talk a little bit about why you may want to use one or the other when it comes to this process. But Power Automate, logic apps, and tying this in with Azure Automation. If you're a Microsoft 365 person, maybe you've played with Azure AD. If you haven't played with Azure Automation as a Microsoft 365 admin, I think you're missing out. This is one of my favorite tools when it comes to Azure and it comes to managing Office 365. So we're going to look a little bit at Azure Automation and how that can tie into Power Automate and Logic Apps. And then SharePoint is going to come into play here primarily as a data source. There's some advantages to kind of sticking Power Apps in the middle or SharePoint in the middle of this. And we're going to talk through that. I'm going to show you some of that as well. Where it's helping to manage those users. Potentially, you could use a database. All the environments I've done this in, using SharePoint has been perfectly fine, works well for what we need to do. And it gives you some of that ability too to even audit and review what changes were made to Azure AD accounts. Again, without necessarily giving access to Azure Active Directory, but it can be viewed all right within that PowerShell list. So, and again, as we go through too, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. That's going to be easier for me to see than people raising their hands. If it's easier to ask, we can even do some come off mute and ask away. So just a sample, before we get into build it, we are not going to have time to build all of this out in today's session with the time that we have. But I wanted to give you a sense of what I did for one particular client. This is the one where it got to be the most complex, I would say, from a what they wanted to do with the Power App. This is that new user screen. So over here, as they are going in and creating new users, they would go in and enter the first name, the last name, display name. We set it up, it automatically filled in, just like it would in Azure AD. But then you'll notice there's nothing for the username. We have a bunch of formulas, calculations that come into play because this particular company had a finance subsidiary and a residential subsidiary. Based on the combination of these two checkboxes, if it was just finance, if it was just residential, or some of them that worked at the parent company dealt with both finance and residential, the domain name would change. So they had, I believe it was two. I don't think they had three different domain names. They had two or three different domain names that it would automatically pick based on the selection and the username. Sometimes they used first initial last name. Sometimes they used first name dot last name. And it would automatically build out that username based on these selections with finance and residential. So they actually did give this app to their HR department. Their HR department didn't have any insight into when they got certain usernames or certain email addresses, but they always knew, does this employee work with finance or do they work with residential? And the username would automatically get built out. They put in the hire date, they would fill in the employee ID. Supervisor, they'd go in and pick from the list of their current users who that supervisor was, and then pick department, job title. And when they selected an office, it automatically went in and selected the right address for that particular office location and generated a password. HR could then save this password. They could go in and um, this password, I think with this one, we set it to be emailed to whoever was filling out the form. So they had a copy of that password as well. But they would just click create user from here. It would go in, create the user, set them with the right password, fill in all of these different properties in Azure AD, from their office to their job title, to their employee ID, hire dates, set their manager the proper way. IT was completely disconnected from HR when it came to creating these new users. Maybe they'd have to go in and had licenses. They tended to keep a few in reserve. They would get notifications when these new users were created, but they never actually had to go in and create these users themselves. Uh, then we went in and built out an edit screen. Same thing. HR could go in, update usernames, office phone numbers, mobile phone numbers. The search would search through all of their users so they could select the right user, make appropriate changes. And this is where we started limiting it. We said, you know what, you can't ever change the hire date. Let's not give that as an option. They're not going to change the username or the employee ID. If those changes need to be made, go contact IT. All the other ones, HR had full control. Go in, make the change, submit that change, and it would go run through Azure AD, update all those users. We did a terminate user screen as well. So similar type of thing. Um, they did have to select, I can't remember what the reason was why we had checkboxes for the two different subsidiaries. We needed that for some reason, but they could go find a user and select that user, and it would fill out a bunch of that information more from a validation perspective. We want to go in, see what, make sure we're selecting the right user, and either terminate them immediately, the flow would go run, disable their account right away, or they could go in and submit that request to happen in a couple weeks. Maybe this was an employee that gave a 2 weeks notice, had a specific date that they were going to quit. They could put this in ahead of time, and that process would essentially pause until that date. And they even needed a leave of absence uh, aspect too. If people were going out for 2, 3 weeks, maternity, paternity leave, long-term disability, um, whatever that was, they could place a user on LOA for their particular scenario. It just blocked their sign-in, left their account in place, left their license in place, blocked their sign-in, and they could use a button to toggle to see all of their active users, or they could go see all their users on leave of absence. If someone was coming back, they could go update that date of when they were going to return, and that would go re-enable their account so they could log back in. Troy, if we set up a termination date or terminate them immediately, does that remove their emails as well? So it would do essentially whatever you wanted it to. What this does, and I'm going to show you this in a minute. This is actually my last slide, and then we're going to go in and start playing with this. This particular client, it blocked their sign-in, and I believe it changed their password. I don't think it did anything else but that. I have another client that I was just working on this with last week. When they terminate a user, it goes in, connects to Exchange Online, converts their mailbox from a user mailbox to a shared mailbox. They have the option in this terminate user screen to select the manager who's going to get rights to their mailbox. So it grants that manager full control of that shared mailbox that's been converted over to a personal mailbox. And then it goes in and actually disables their on-premises account and moves them to a different OU on-premises. because they're still running in a hybrid mode with an on-prem domain controller. So we did a few tricks there to actually go in and adjust all those Exchange settings and then go connect to an on-prem domain controller and make all of those changes to their on-prem domain controller. Uh, so it's completely customizable, and that's the joy of this. And again, I'm going to show you how I did this. So going in, demoing different options and showing you how you might go in and build one of these solutions. Um, we're going to start with Power Apps. We'll start with the UI, the front end, building that out. I have a user management app that I already have here that is just kind of a small subset of the functionality. So we can go through that and I can show you how this is built. Maybe we'll add a little bit of functionality to it. But let's go in and edit this particular Power App. And I'll show you some of the things that I'm doing. There's a few tricks that I've done in this, especially around creating passwords and why I use SharePoint. We'll start talking through some of that too. And hopefully this loads. I don't know if anybody else has noticed this. If you do stuff with Power Apps and Power Automate, has it seemed really slow for everybody the last couple of months? I feel like it's gotten slower over time. And it just continues. Tim said yes. All right, I have some agreement here. I'm still getting things ready. Okay, good. I feel better that I'm not alone. And hopefully this is actually gonna load. This is gonna be really hard to demo this if we spend 15 minutes getting things ready. I may have to try a new tab and see if that works. I even tested this before. Leave the page. See if we can get it to wake up. Now it's probably going to tell me I have the session locked and I have to override my own session. If not, we could try building this from scratch, but that would definitely be a challenge. Oh, there it goes. Perfect. Okay, so the first thing is the passwords. This is the one that actually took me a little bit to figure out. Over here, I haven't labeled it. It's a password screen. I have a new button down here that goes and creates a random password every time I click it. This, and I have a YouTube video. I can go find the link. I can post it in the chat later because it'll save you a bunch of typing. So how I go in and do these passwords to make sure they adhere to any type of the password regulations that Microsoft has, uppercase, lettercase, characters, all of that, is in this on visible. I think I put it in invisible. Yep, on visible for a new user screen. I go in, and this is where I can save you a bunch of typing because I have this all in comments on a YouTube video where I walked through just creating random passwords. But I go create an entire array of all the uppercase letters. Then I go create an array of all the lowercase letters. Then I go in and do an array of all the numeric passwords. And then this is essentially clicking this new password button. So you can do a select button and it will go in and do like a click of the button in the background. So realistically, what I'm actually doing here every time you show this screen is I can go in and set my password button to be hidden. And it's just this hidden button on the screen. Nobody can ever click it. But different actions that I take within my app go in and actually click that button on the background to get a new password. So that password is going in and grabbing that whole array of password characters. And you have to do an array because there's no way to shuffle a string. So this takes all those uppercase letters, shuffles them all up, and puts them in some new random array. And then I go out and flatten it out. I do the same thing with the lowercase letters. This shuffles them. I believe this value, I'm trying to remember, concat shuffle variables. I may set this value somewhere. I may have set that. No, that's what stores it. Anyways, this shuffles it up. This goes in, shuffles all those together, shuffles up all my lowercase letters, shuffles up all my numbers. And I'm left with a random array or random string of uppercase letters, lowercase letters, and numbers. Then I go in and I just grab the first two letters from that randomized uppercase. I go grab the first three letters of the randomized lowercase or the randomized numbers, and I go grab the next three characters of the lowercase password. If you wanted longer passwords, you can easily go in and make this like 5, 6, and 6. And then when you'd go and create a new password, you'd just start getting longer passwords. It would grab more random characters from there. Originally, I did have this set where I was trying to combine all of these and shuffle them all up, but I wasn't, in certain cases, I wouldn't get any uppercase letters or I wouldn't get any lowercase letters. And it didn't actually meet the password requirements, and creating my user would fail. So I couldn't randomize it quite as much as I wanted to. I kept that format of so many uppercase, so many lowercase, so many numbers. But that's how you can randomize it. And again, with that button click on there, whenever the screen is visible, what you can do after the fact is you can go in and set the visible to false, and then it just hides it, and I can play it. And then down here, I can't click it, but as I flip between these screens, every time, like it's BQP, if I would go edit one and come back, I get a new password. Because OnVisible happens whenever you load the app, every time you load the app, it would do it as well. You could also create like a clear button or a create new user or reset form button on this same thing. That would do just that. It would go wipe out the first name, wipe out the last name, UPNs, titles, and reset it and regenerate a password at the same time. Other than that, this new user form is pretty straightforward. It's just a first name, it's a last name, my display name. I take that first name, I put a space in there, I take the last name, and then the UPN, this is where you can go in and enforce a certain format for your username. So in this case, I'm doing first initial and the last name, and then I'm adding on my domain name. So if I would go in and type in my name, it would put the first name in there. You can see it just grabbed the first initial so far for my UPN. I can go do my last name, and I left this display name will automatically update. But if you want to change it, if you want your nickname in there, I left it so you'd have the ability to go in and change it. This could be totally up to you if you wanted to do that or not. But I'm going to go create a new user. So we'll do MN365 and do a demo user. Ooh, I confused it with my space. This is the other thing you have to watch out for is if you do spaces and last names or special characters and last names. We can make that the CEO. I'm just going to click new user. This triggers that process to go in and create a new user. And we'll go back and look at what actually happened there here in a little bit. Edit user is just a button to switch to another screen. And this is, again, kind of that app I showed, very similar, where it's just different fields, and then it does give an option to go in and search through the list. We're going to come back to that. Sorry, I'm jumping back to my new user. I want to show you what happened. We clicked this button. What this button does is this button goes in, and this is a user management list in SharePoint. So all this is doing is it's saying, go out, take all of these different properties, collect them together, go write them to a user management list in SharePoint, and go put the display name out there. surname, given name, job title, the UPN, and I do have a Boolean field in that SharePoint list that does set that create new user to true. So we know this is a new user, and I'll get into why we do that. And then I do collect the password and save it to a password um, SharePoint list. And I've played around with different ways to keep this password secure. Uh, this one, I write it to a different list so that when I
Oh,
run a flow later,
crazy.
I can email that password to specific people, and then I can go delete the password from the list afterwards. So there is a password stored out there in a SharePoint list in plain text for a minute or two while the user's getting created. That whole process is running, but then it gets deleted right away, so there's no record of it. I've done what I showed you in the other app where I just put it on the screen and I don't actually record it anywhere. Leave it up to the user creating it to save that password somewhere and give it to the user. Um, the other thing with all of these, I always have it set for the user to change their password on last login. So hopefully they're logging in soon. That password's not even going to be out there for a long time. So that's one thing to think through if you go through this whole process is how you want to handle that password, what level of security you need. Do you never want that to be in a SharePoint list? Technically, then it would go into the recycle bin. Um, when I save it out there, you'll notice I just saved the password. I don't associate it with a user. So even if you would find all those passwords in the recycle bin, you wouldn't necessarily know what user that password belongs to. Um, because I'm always creating it, deleting it, there should only ever be one password in that list. So I always know that it's the current user that's being created that that password belongs to. Now, maybe if you had 10 people all creating users simultaneously, that might fall apart a little bit. You'd have to think through how you want to handle those passwords. Um, again, that's the one area of this whole solution that you kind of want to think through is how do you want to handle those passwords? Uh, when we get into edit user, I'm going to go flip over to the edit user screen. This is also interacting with that same SharePoint list. So you'll see this theme. All of my Power Apps integrates directly into a SharePoint list. Um, and that's actually my source of truth. I am not connecting my Power App directly to Azure Active Directory. Um, reason being is when I'm going in and editing users, and this is just doing a filter, searching um, for those users. Whoops, let me go back to my search again. So when I'm going in and editing users, it's going in, doing a filter. I can sort with first name, last name, any of those, pull it in, update it. You'll see this is updating a user. And did I not actually build out a minute? My button, this is all acting up. Update user. Update user should not have white on select. There it goes. That was odd. This does a patch. So to update or write these users is a patch or a collect. Collect is create a new one. Patch will go update it. So I'm updating for my selected user and updating all that information. That is all going over to this SharePoint list. So here's that user we created, their display name, their user principal name, their given name, their surname, their job title. The reason I do this with a SharePoint list is if your Power App integrates directly into Azure Active Directory, there is a connector out there. You can go use an Azure Active Directory connector. Might be able to use the Office 365 user connector, but Power Apps will act on Azure Active Directory as the user you're logged into Power Apps with. So in that case, my user that I'm logged in with would have to have rights to Azure AD, which negates one of those benefits I mentioned earlier of maybe you don't want HR to have access to Azure Active Directory. Uh, Using this SharePoint list, you give HR only access to this SharePoint list, and then we'll go see the next portion of it is the SharePoint list kicks off the process, and then you can actually go do all those actions in Azure Active Directory with a service account that has access to Azure Active Directory versus the user that's logged uh, into your Power Apps environment. Um, so that's why I do the SharePoint list. It also gives you some of that flexibility. So I go in and can't remember. Let's go do this on this one. Let's go into site information, not site information. I want to go look at list information, list settings. And did I have versioning on? Yes, versioning is on this list. So this SharePoint list also gives me that ability now is when I'm in Power Apps and I go in and I have this user and maybe I decided this should just be M365 demo. Make sure I have that selected, update user. This goes in and updates that SharePoint list over here, user management. I can actually go see the version history, and I've had this come up before with a user or with one of my clients where they wanted to go in and see when a particular value was changed, when a display name was changed, when a username was changed, whatever that is. Uh, and yeah, Kirk, that is one downside of this approach is that this SharePoint list is a copy of every Azure AD user and potentially even more. Because this would also go in and show like when a user got deprovisioned, or when a user got removed, and they may actually get removed from Azure AD and stay in the list. So in some essence, it can get really big, but then I also do have that audit of this is when this particular user was deprovisioned or marked for deprovisioning. Um, so yeah, it is a copy of all my Azure AD users. I have not scaled this out to in the magnitude of thousands of users yet. One of my clients is using this, and their list may be up over 1,000 now. They have 700 to 800 active employees, and their SharePoint list is a copy of Azure AD. Um, when we first set it up, we actually wrote PowerShell to go through and grab all of this information out of Azure Active Directory. We threw it all in a CSV, and then we ran an import and imported it all into the SharePoint list to get that initial copy. And they trained all their employees, all their users, IT, HR, whoever was going in to update users, that the only way you update users is with the Power App. Um, I'll, they've since changed their strategy. Uh, they don't use the Power App anymore. Now they actually take an export of a CSV from their HR system and go update the SharePoint list. And then the SharePoint list triggers all of the processes to go update the users in Azure AD. So they're still using that exact copy in the SharePoint list. Um, and they do have some other reasons for it as well. And one of them is when certain changes were made, they would want to review them. And I don't know where my new user one went, but we added some extra columns even to their SharePoint list. So even though HR was making all these updates and pushing them all through, IT could go into this user management list, just do a filter and see who are all the users that HR updated the last day, and then quickly scan through them and they would have to approve certain changes. So they could go through and hit a checkbox to go in and approve a particular change in the SharePoint list, and then that would go trigger the process to go make all the updates in Azure AD. So long story, it is a copy. They have found a lot of benefits to actually doing that. Um, Again, if you started scaling this out to your SharePoint list item limit is technically 5,000. Power Apps and SharePoint can start having some issues at 2,000. You could, in theory, start hitting some constraints if you started trying to scale this out to 2,500, 3,000, 10,000 users, uh, where your SharePoint list is having a direct copy of what's in Azure Active Directory. That's where, in theory, you can maybe go use a SQL database. You could do some things to get around that and still use a SharePoint list. Um, but that is the case here, is that you are using that SharePoint list as that exact copy and kind of that middleman between Power Apps and between uh, Azure Active Directory. Power Apps, updating that list. Yeah, viewing that audit history. So to actually kick this process off, that's where it starts moving into Power Automate. Power Automate, I shared this flow with me. I have a user management flow in Power Automate that is where all of those additional processes take place. Uh, in here, if we go edit the flow, this is triggered by an item being created or modified in that SharePoint list. So I am going out, I'm looking at that site address, that list name, and one of the other things I've done, this is kind of a nifty feature in Power Automate, if you've never played with it, is on a trigger, you can go into your settings on the trigger and set a trigger condition in here. This trigger condition is actually looking at that change in that SharePoint list, and this flow only triggers when that trigger condition of run update is set to true. What this does is it prevents this flow from triggering when we wouldn't necessarily want to run the update. I talked before about that that client that wanted to review changes before it actually ran the update. In that case, we wouldn't set this run update to true when a user was made, and we would maybe look at once approved was equal to true, or when they would review it, and then once they reviewed it, they would manually click run update is equal to true. There's other ways you can do this. You could put a condition in here to look at that value and only run certain things if it was true, or just terminate the flow right away if it's false. If you're running into issues with flow quotas, you may not want to run the flow. So this actually prevents the flow from running needlessly, I would say. So here, this was today's. You can see this was succeeded. If I would go back to this SharePoint list and edit a particular field on here, we can go, we'll just add an employee ID in here. Employee 12345. Technically, that was a change. Without that condition, this would trigger that flow. We go in and watch this, this flow won't actually trigger again until I would go in and set that run update to true. So it saves on some of that flow quota. It saves from showing a bunch of flows running that do nothing because we didn't actually want to run that update yet. So let's go back in, edit that some more. So that's how I decide. We created a new user, this flow is going to run. I still did put a condition in here too for new user because I wanted to differentiate between when is this a new user and I have to take certain actions because it's a new user versus when it's an update user. So first I looked at run update or not. Then I looked at are we creating a new user or are we editing a user? If we're creating a new user, this is where I go into that SharePoint list and I go grab that password from that password list in SharePoint so that I have it for the user because I need to go in and set that password when I create the new user. This is a little bit, this is a goofy one too because of how get items works and how I was doing it. It doesn't apply to each. It's only ever going to be one user in there, so it's only ever going to do this once. But I use that Azure AD connector and I go create a new user. You can set that user to account enabled. I set the display name, the mail nickname. I just do a function in here to get a substring before this looks for that at symbol in the UPN, gets a substring so that that mail nickname, you don't want your at UPN in there. You just want the uh, beginning of it. So this goes in and just gets that portion before the at sign. This password is what I grabbed from this list. One downside, and this is why I needed to do that random password too. This create user action in Power Automate doesn't allow you to specify, let Azure AD randomly create the password. You have to specify a password. So somehow you need to get a random password to pass into the password field when you create a user. User principal name, given name, surname. There are some additional properties you can set with this create user. You can go in and set the department, the job title, uh, mobile phone, office location, business phone. Technically, you should be able to do it here. This is, it's an array. It's a little goofy. I don't use this for the business phone. Uh, but you'll notice certain things, create user. I don't have the option to set a manager. I can't set the employee ID. I can't set the hire date. There's a bunch of those extra properties that are missing when you create a new user. Um, we'll talk about that in a minute here. Then I delete that item. So once I've created that user, I've used that password, I go in and delete it right away so that that password's not hanging out there unnecessarily. And then I go create a job in Azure Automation. And this one, you can see this is where I'm not passing them all in, but this is where I can go in and start pushing things into Azure Automation or into Azure AD, such as the company, the country, the city, mobile phone numbers, states, employee IDs. I pass in the user principal name because I do need that to find the user, manager, email, all of that. Uh, you will notice as well, and this is where some of that discussion gets into Logic Apps versus Power Automate. This was all great from a connector's perspective and running under basic Power Automates until I got to this create job, this Azure Automation. This Azure Automation connector is a premium connector in Power Automate. So if you have the ability to use premium connectors, this is an option. If you don't have the licensing for premium connectors in Power Automate, you're either going to have to go get those licenses, or this is where we can start looking at Logic Apps. Slight differences, but you can accomplish all of this for cheaper in Logic Apps than you can to go purchase a premium connector in Power Automate. Troy, can you assign a new SharePoint owner through this application as well? I have not built that into this, but technically you could. You could absolutely let me think through this. You'd have to have a list of all your SharePoint sites so that they could select it, similar to how I did this with users. Um, so you may, kind of to Kirk's question of a SharePoint list as a copy of a Azure AD, you may need to have a SharePoint list that's a copy of all your SharePoint sites. Um, you may or may not have that. I have a whole nother session I do all about governing teams and SharePoint, where I do something similar to this, only it's to create new SharePoint sites and teams, and it leverages the same type of technique where I have a SharePoint list with all my SharePoint sites. So as long as you had that ability to be able to select a SharePoint site uh, via dropdown, so similar to how I did edit users here, um, where you could go in and like search for a SharePoint site, select that SharePoint site, and then a drop down over here with a user and select the user that you want to be an owner of it. This same process would work where you could then go trigger a flow within Power Automate to go update that site owner. There is an action in here. I haven't tried this. Sometimes this changes as much as the admin center. I know there's a change permissions within SharePoint. Um, so if you go in here, permission, I thought there was a permission in SharePoint. Maybe not. If there's not a change permission in here, I thought I had seen that one in here. There's a resolve person. Maybe it's not permission. Maybe it's access. Ba, 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 ba. Grant access. Okay, so there's not one to do the owners. No, that's fine. Try. I'll come back to that. Uh, I'll show you how you can. Azure Automation will take care of it for you. I'm going to show you Azure Automation here in a minute. Um, you would have to do an Azure Automation and create a job to go in and run some PowerShell to actually associate or change those permissions. But back on topic, create a job. You'll see this is going out to an Azure subscription, resource group, automation account, runbook name, update Azure AD user properties. I have used this more times with Office 365. If you go out to Azure, and you do need a subscription for this, however, it's going to cost you very little money. Oh, that was my Logic app. Just a minute. IntelliJ Dev. I have to switch users. Let's see. I can't remember what permissions I gave myself in here. I think I'm okay. Resources. Here it is. Azure Automation account. This is an Azure Automation account. If you don't have one and you're looking to create one, let's just create a resource. Go look for an automation resource. If search works okay, it works. It's just automation. Auto. Now it doesn't want to work. That's odd. So, oh, it's down here. I don't know why it doesn't search for it. There is an automation. You just go create automation account, and it's a pretty straightforward process. Subscription, resource group, region, name. If you want a managed identity with it, there's some cool things you can do with managed identities, networking. That's it. You go create it, and away you go. I already created one. And what, in a nutshell, Azure Automation can do a bunch of things. There's a whole lot of things you can do with it. For the purpose of this conversation and using it with Power Automate, it is a way to run PowerShell in the cloud. If you go look under shared resources here and modules, if you've done anything with PowerShell before, you'll start recognizing a bunch of these Azure modules. if you go look, I don't know if I put SharePoint ones in here or not yet. Uh, my SharePoint module is not installed. And here I was using the Azure AD one or the Microsoft Graph one. Graph, Azure accounts. Azure AD should be in here somewhere. Um, unless I did the preview, Azure AD preview. I'm using it. It's out there. It's just that search is all kinds of broken today. But if you don't have one, you can go out and browse the gallery. This is just looking at that normal PS gallery. So because you asked about SharePoint, you can go find the Microsoft Online SharePoint modules. You can find the SharePoint PnP PowerShell online. Uh, select it. Select it. Select your runtime version. It does do 5.1 or 7.1. There are some weird things. This does not always work just like on-premises PowerShell. So I have had some weird things before with 5.1 versus 7.1. This will go out, start installing that module. So any of those commandlets are now available to use within PowerShell in Azure Automation. Other than that, you have your runbooks, and these are PowerShell scripts. So here's that update Azure AD user PowerShell runbook that I created earlier. If we go open this up, you'll see the overview, the activity log, jobs, schedules, a bunch of stuff. You have your view and your edit. We'll just go into edit, and this is just a PowerShell script. These are all those parameters that you saw in Power Automate when we triggered this runbook, where it's the UPN, the zip code, the state, street, employee ID. Here I grab credentials, so you do have the ability to save credentials within Azure Automation. So this is a saved username and password to connect to Azure AD. Then it goes and based on, I do a bunch of checks for like if mobile phone number is there or office phone number, just a bunch of else if, so I don't try to write some null values. I ran into some issues there if I'd go try to set the Azure AD user with a null value. So I figure out what's trying or what has values in it, what doesn't, and only write those. But that's all this is doing is now I have that option to go set Azure AD user, pass in the UPN, and set those additional properties that weren't built into that on-premises connector. The company name has to get set a little differently. So here I had to use the set Azure AD user extension and set the extension name for employee ID and company name. And then because Microsoft, the manager has to get set yet a different way. So I have to go get the manager's Azure AD user based on their email, and then use set Azure AD user manager to pass in the object ID of the manager and of the user. This is just PowerShell. There's nothing fancy to it. So to Troy's question about using this to update SharePoint site owners, you can use this PowerShell to update site owners. This is how, in that other example, we convert Exchange mailboxes from personal mailboxes to shared mailboxes when a user gets deprovisioned, is we went in and wrote a PowerShell script to go connect to Exchange Online, convert that mailbox from personal to shared, update the permissions on the mailbox, all of that type of stuff. So you can do this with Exchange Online, with SharePoint, you can do it with Azure Active Directory, you can go run PowerShell against Microsoft Teams. Anything you can write PowerShell against on premises, you can use Azure Automation for to write PowerShell against Office 365. If you're in a hybrid environment where you have an on-premises domain controller and you need to run PowerShell against an on-premises domain controller, did you create the PowerShell and put it in the runbook? Yeah, Neil, I did. And I can go create a quick one. It is not the friendliest authoring experience. We could do a demo PowerShell script, runbook type. So you can pick, you can do Python, some PowerShell workflow, pick PowerShell. We can do 7.1 for this one and create a runbook. And then from here, you're given that authoring pane. So you can do like write, output. This is my output. I wanted to get those creds. So creds equals, and this is one where you don't necessarily have to write it. You can go to my user management creds and add to Canvas, and it drops that in there. A equals, if you were doing get Azure AD user, tab complete works sometimes, not all the times. Like you can see the commands I've already used, but if I go try a new one, ooh, this has gotten a little better. So tab complete was not always in. Oh, they did add more stuff. So tab complete didn't always work. This has not been the most friendly and this has not been the friendliest authoring experience in the past. Where none of the tab complete or anything worked. So I tend to write it just in Visual Studio Code, write it on my own workstation, and then copy and paste into the runbook, and then just save and publish. The other thing you can do, and I do this for more of my production environments, is I still write it all um, on local machines, but you can go down to source control and you can connect this to GitHub to DevOps, and it will select the repository, select the branch, all of that, and set this to synchronize, and it will synchronize your source control and all of your PowerShell scripts in source control into your runbooks up here. So that way you can put source control on it, because one thing that can happen is if you go in and delete one of these, there's not a recycle bin, there's no way to get it back, it's gone. I've done that before by mistake. So that's why production environments, I try to encourage people use source control, sync it up from there, and have those local copies around. So even with source control, then you can roll back your branch. You can go get that if it got inadvertently deleted from Power Automate. So I have all kinds of different scripts that I'll run out here, especially if I don't want to have to connect to a server. Again, deprovisioning users, creating teams, creating Microsoft 365 groups. You can go do all kinds of things when it comes to Azure Automation and PowerShell. Back to the on-premises stuff. So I have done this twice now. Once because I wanted to trigger off a script using a tool that existed in an on-premises server. The other time because we had to work with Active Directory and an on-premises domain controller. You have hybrid worker groups. I don't have any in this environment. Creating a hybrid worker group, you can go set up a server. This can be on-premises. This can be a server in Azure as a hybrid worker, and it will show up in Azure Automation. You don't have to open up any incoming ports, anything like that. The server reaches out to Azure Automation, and it will, when you go in and run a runbook, so if you go in and run one of these, down here on the bottom, right now I don't have a hybrid worker. It gives you the option to run on Azure or run on your hybrid worker. If you select hybrid worker, the hybrid worker is communicating with Azure Automation. It'll see that a job was submitted. It will go out, pull the runbook down. So pull that PowerShell script down to the local server and run it locally on the server and return all the results back to Azure. So that way you could go run it in a server on premises that has access to your domain controller. You can run it as an admin against a local domain controller and run all of those scripts in that on-premises server and give you that ability to use tools that are on-premises, give you that ability to work with your users that are in Active Directory in that Azure AD hybrid type scenario. So that's Azure Automation. Again, we could talk about this. I've done whole sessions just on stuff you can do with Azure Automation. But that is how I go in and account for any of those things that I can't do when I'm working with users, when I've been building these solutions out, when I have to go take some action in an on-premises server, I go use this create job in Power Automate. One thing I mentioned was, what if you don't have access to those premium connectors for Power Automate? You can do all of this that I just showed you in Power Automate in Logic Apps as well. So back in Azure Automation, let's go back to this one, or back in Azure, I created a user management demo Logic app. Under the covers, Power Apps is actually using Logic Apps to run everything. You can export flows in Power Automate to Logic Apps and then import them into Logic Apps and run them here. You'll notice it's actually a very similar, borderline the exact same interface as Power Automate. You can still go in and do SharePoint for a trigger. The one thing here is that when you go in and look for an item being created or modified, that trigger that I used for Power Automate is only time-based. Go sign in. Oh, it failed. The browser's closed. The browser's not closed. I just signed in with it. Hopefully this will work. Try it once more. Okay, I'll blame the browser. That's a little odd. So once you connect, when you're using Logic Apps, it actually is set up to do a poll. So you have to specify every 5 seconds, every 10 seconds, every minute, go and look at that SharePoint list and look for new items that are created. So this Logic app is running every so many minutes, every so many seconds that you go in and specify. The advantage of a Logic app is there isn't that same sense of premium connectors. So if you want to go create or go connect to Azure Automation, oh, I spelled it wrong. If you want to go run one of those runbooks in Azure Automation, you can go select your Azure Automation account, create a job. We'll see, I'm not connected and it doesn't want to let me connect. But you can go do all of those same things right in Logic Apps. Logic Apps, biggest differences with Logic Apps and Power Automate. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold and I need a cough. All right, let's see if I can get through this a minute. Logic Apps you actually pay per run and per connector instead of having a quota. However, it is really, really cheap. You go look at Logic Apps pricing. I should have had this pulled up. I can't remember how many zeros there are in front of it. It's something like 25 thousandths of a cent per run. So you'd want to do the consumption run. Here you go. So your first 4,000 actions are free. So if you have so many actions, each action is each block. Again, it's really cheap to run there. You do have your standard connections and enterprise connections um, based on the number of calls, but even that's not even a whole cent per call. Usually you end up paying for something like a deprovision flow if you can minimize the actions that you to what you absolutely have to do in it. Uh, you can do this for 5, $10 a month at the most, which is way cheaper than like the $40 per user per month or $5 per user per month for some of those Power App premium connectors. Uh, so a lot of times when I do get into those situations where clients don't necessarily have those premium connectors in Power Apps, but they do have them in, or they're okay to use Logic Apps, we just go build all this in Logic Apps instead of in Power App or in Power Automate to run that workflow, trigger those Azure automation runbooks, all of that type of stuff. Um, so going back, we never actually showed that one running. So I created that user way back at the beginning of all of this. And you may have seen the run history. So this was the one when we first created that user. You'll see when I created my MN365 user, here was that item being created or modified. The condition in this case was it was a new user. I went in, the password does get shown somewhere in here, I think when I create it. So it went and it grabbed the password. It ran that create user. So this was my user. This was my password it created. Given name. Nobody better go log into my tenant right now with that account. Doesn't have a license. They're not going to do much. It has no admin roles. Logs in. It went and deleted that password from the list. This is where it went in and triggered that job to update the Azure AD properties. It gave me some outputs that it completed. And then I go in after all of that and I just update that user and that user management list to set that the run update is false. I think I set new user back to false as well, just to kind of reset that list back to those original settings. That ran in Azure Automation, so we can go back to our Azure Automation account back here, where we ran that script. And for each of these, we can go look at our runbook, update user properties. Here's that same run that ran a little earlier. We can go look at all of the logs and set Azure. See, I wonder what happened to that module. It did not like the fact this failed setting some of those properties. For some reason, I lost my Azure AD module in Azure Automation. So when I couldn't find it earlier, it really wasn't there and this didn't run. But this was just updating a few of those additional properties. If I would go back and look at my users in Office 365 now, refresh this and get all of our users back, we will have our MN365 demo. There's that UPN. It has no licenses. But there's that user. It's been provisioned. You'll notice the username also is when I made that edit, it ran against that edit and removed the user from the name. And I have that user. It's good to go. I can manage it from the list. I can manage it from the Power App here. This is one I haven't built out the full terminate user or LOA in this demo one yet. It's just been that edit in new user. Hopefully that helps. Hopefully everybody made sense. Everybody got some ideas of how they can go in and automate some things, use some Power Automate stuff to manage your environment. The only thing I don't have here, I've thought about building it out and adding it to this, but and I have a client that went in and did it themselves. They actually then created a Power BI report as well. That would be the last component of the Power Platform you could tie in. they have a Power BI report that goes in and connects to this user management list. So they can go in and view some additional reports around all of those users in their list. New users that were created, users that were modified, changed, updated, any of that. So I think we have about 15 minutes left, if I'm right. Tim, I know I've been answering some questions as we've gone along, but we do have time if anybody has any questions or wanted me to dive more into anything that we've gone through. If I breeze through something too fast, you wanted to see some details of how something was created, uh, let me know. I can jump back to that screen share too. Or feel free to reach out. I mentioned on-prem AD. Uh, yeah, so Nick or Neil, sorry. Neil said, can you reach into on-prem AD between AD and Azure AD? So I breezed through that a little quickly. You can do that through these hybrid workers in Azure Automation. Hybrid worker groups allow you to connect a server, whether it's on premises or a server in Azure AD, a jump box that has access to your on-prem AD. This will, once you set this up, install the agent and connect it, you can run these PowerShell scripts or these runbooks in an on-premises server that has access to that on-prem AD. So the client I did this with that's in the hybrid exchange and wanted to disable on-prem users, we set up essentially a script server. I think they set up a VM in their VMware environment or something, installed the AD management tools in that on-premises server, and then we joined that scripting server as one of those hybrid workers. And when a user gets deprovisioned, it kicks off one runbook to go in and make the changes in Exchange Online. And then it kicks off a second runbook in that hybrid worker that goes in and makes all those changes to that user in the on-premises domain controller.
Yeah, so our users originate on-prem, so that's the source of authority, and then
Yep.
Didn't realize there was any way to update from the cloud back into AD because because a lot of those fields say that doesn't allow you to update.
Right. So you'd have to do that all as a hybrid worker. So in theory, instead of using, let me go up to this connection. So instead of using this connector, where I connected to Azure AD, get items, you can do all of that, and then just ignore this one and go straight to an Azure automation job and write everything in PowerShell. So create the user with PowerShell, set the password, do all of that. And then if you have hybrid worker groups, it will show, and it may have it. Yeah, it will show up as a hybrid worker group here. So you can specify that whole PowerShell script to create that on-prem AD user and all of that, and run it in that hybrid worker and run it in an on-premises server.
Is that like a totally different kind of source of authority?
So what that does, it's not changing the source of authority. It's just running it in the context or running it on a server that has access to your domain controller. So your SharePoint list would still be the same, your Power App would still be the same, but instead of running it against Azure AD with these built-in commands or with the Azure AD PowerShell, you'd be running it on that server using the native Active Directory PowerShell commandlets.
Thank you.
Yep, not a problem. Any other questions? If you do want to, I mentioned a bunch of that, like creating those random passwords. That Power Apps video is out here on my YouTube channel if you want to go copy and paste a bunch of the random passwords. Connect with me anywhere here if you want to ask me a question offline too. Yeah, or any other questions? We've got 10 minutes left or so before the next presentation. Although I know Tim has to give something away too, I think, right?
Yep, that's correct. We
This-
still have the $25 gift certificate.
All right, so this is your chance. You have 5 minutes to ask a question, participate in chat, and have an opportunity to win a $25 gift card to go spend on Azure credits to do Azure automation stuff. Patrick, could you do delays between multiple scripts to run secondary things like direct routing, number assignments, one slice? Yes, absolutely, Patrick. I've had to do that before. I'm glad you actually asked that. So I have had to do things before in here where, to your point, you do like the create user, you go create the job and update them all. And then down here, you can do a delay action. And there is a delay schedule and specify the count. You can do like 60 minutes and delay it for 60 minutes until some of that kicks in and go assign that number. I'm trying to think what other scenario. There was another scenario I ran into where I had to introduce a delay because of that time to for things to propagate. You could also do this like in Neil's scenario, where on-prem AD is your source of truth. You go create the user in AD, and maybe it takes 5 or 10 minutes for that user to sync up to Azure Active Directory before you can apply licenses to them. You could set this delay to be like 20 minutes after you create the user on-prem. Then you go in and assign licensing to them. So yeah, introducing this delay, it's super easy. Flow will run. You can have a flow in an active running state for up to 30 days. So you can delay 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, do something, delay another hour, delay for another hour. If for some reason it hangs out longer than 30 days, it'll kill it. But that's how, when I even do like the scheduling a termination, you can schedule it 2 weeks in advance. All I did in that delay was when they pick a date, you could either delay like 2 weeks, or I will do a delay until. You may have seen that action in here. There's this delay until, and then you can actually put in a date. So if someone has a date that you want to deprovision them, or they're going on leave of absence, you delay until that specific date that was selected. And that flow just kind of sits there running, but it's paused until that delay date, and then it kicks off the rest of it. Any other questions? I like questions. They're more fun because it actually applies to you.
I actually got a quick one. With the announcement at night about Entra, how do you see in the lifecycle workflows, how do you see that fitting in with the Power Automate? Is it something where, Power Automate may kick off the lifecycle workflow or vice versa? Or is this maybe a way to do things a little bit more granularly than the lifecycle workflows allow you to do?
I would say this is probably going to be a more granular way. I don't see them doing just how they've done other lifecycle management stuff. I don't see them tying lifecycle management directly into Power Automate. I would see lifecycle lifecycle probably being alongside of it. You're going to get some functionality in lifecycle. If you want to go build out a bunch of other stuff, do it in Power Automate.
Gotcha.
I don't have any inside knowledge, but that would be my speculation. So Patrick said you could do a logic app to lifecycle management, but it seemed limited. That's and Ellie, I see your question. I'll get to yours in just a minute. That's been my biggest struggle with even some of it. like even this Azure AD one, it's like they give you this Azure AD connector, and it's super limited. This create job is by far my favorite connector in all of Power Automate because it removes the limitations that Microsoft puts in place with connectors like Azure AD. Because at this point in time, you're just writing PowerShell. So if you can do it in PowerShell, you can do it via this action in Power Automate. Kind of like Stacy said in the last section, if it's in the admin center, you can do it in PowerShell. So if it's an admin center, if you can do it in PowerShell, if you can use this connector, you can do it in PowerShell, and the sky's the limit. Ellie, if the flow is running and paused, does it take up RAM? Potentially, but you're not worried about it because it's all running in Power Automate. Excuse me. So Microsoft isn't going to punish you or ding you or anything like that for that flow running in Power Automate because it's running off in their cloud environment out there. And if you're doing it with the on-prem and the hybrid workers, you're probably not going to introduce the pause in the PowerShell script running on the server. You're going to go run a script and then introduce the pause and flow and then go run another script. So the answer, yeah, probably takes up RAM, but it's not something that you need to worry about due to where all of those actions are going to run and where it's going to be sitting when it's paused. All right. Any last questions before Tim gives $25 gift cards away? Or a $25 gift card, a singular, not plural.
More to come with other sessions, but only one for this one. Well, thank you very much. I learned quite a bit there. It was, like I said, this is one of the sessions I was looking forward to the most, and I thought it was extremely. There's some things I have to go talk to some of my clients about next week now too. So, I'm gonna do a few things. I'm gonna throw the keynote meeting link. Sorry, it's a long link, but that's a link to the afternoon keynote here. That's the only session that's going on between noon and 1. When we come back at 1 o'clock, we have governance, information, and management and teams. What you need to know with Joy Apple. That's in the administration track. If you want to check out the remaining tracks for today, there's a speaker wall board. I have, let me present here because I have my fancy wheel of names set up. And we're going to see, these are the people that were participating in the conversation. I'm going to give her a spin here. It's Brenda. Brenda, I know your email address, so I will send you out the gift certificate when we get a second here. So congrats, Brenda. And the survey link, let's do that real quick. I'm sure you guys have seen the survey link 100 times, but I'm afraid Michelle will fire me if I don't give it to you. So no, I'm just kidding. Here it is. And once again, that survey link will let you give feedback on each one of the sessions. So best done when you're done watching the sessions for the day, so you can give feedback and really give, let Ben know how you like the session. We appreciate that from the speaker perspective as well as from the user group perspective. Helps us develop content. But once again, Ben, thank you. It was excellent.
Not a problem. Thank you. And I will reiterate, I love feedback. You can give me good feedback. Give me negative feedback though, because it helps me know how to get better at these. I'm always looking for how to improve these. So I really do, in all honesty, appreciate negative feedback of what I could have done better. So fill out the surveys.
Thank you.